The story began after a battle that was never really a fair fight. Soldiers of the Empire mocked a frontier tribe for ever thinking they could win. A man in golden armor told the survivors they should be grateful for the Emperor's mercy. Their lives would be spared, but only if their whole clan was handed over to the Empire. The conquerors looked down on the beaten tribe, and a young man with red hair lay dying on the ground. With his last breath, he cursed them all as barbarians. The scene jumped to a divine realm where an old man and an angel bowed their heads, apologizing for a mistake they'd made. Our protagonist stood there completely lost, just a simple soul, wondering out loud if he was actually dead. The old man explained it plainly. There'd been a traffic accident and he was supposed to survive it, but the angel had pulled him into the afterlife too soon. He was sorry for the mix-up and mentioned the man had died young, still a virgin, at which point the guy shouted back that he definitely wasn't. Since he seemed willing to go back, the old man checked his file, only to find out his body had already been cremated in the human world. The news left him completely stunned. The angel started scolding the old man for being so careless, while our guy panicked at the thought that he could never go home again. To put an end to the chaos, the old man silenced them both and announced they had an emergency solution for exactly this kind of mess. He explained that since going home was off the table, they'd reincarnate him into another world instead, but he warned there was no guarantee of a safe birth since he'd have to take over the body of someone who'd just died. Thinking back on his pretty ordinary first life and mildly surprised to hear he'd already had a funeral, the man figured he might as well give a new life a shot, especially with the old man owning up to the mistake. The old man was happy with that answer, and when the guy asked what kind of abilities he'd get, the angel jumped in eagerly, offering to be his guide. She started rattling off powers: a body tough as steel, a built-in grasp of the local language, then suggested throwing in a knowledge skill kind of like a modern smartphone, which struck him as completely out of nowhere. Right then, a bell rang through the divine hall, marking the end of the workday, and the old man wrapped up the meeting on the spot. He was serious about keeping a healthy work-life balance, leaving the man desperate for more answers about the reincarnation he was about to go through. As they started to fade from view, the old man gave a thumbs up and promised he'd get special abilities based on whatever the angel decided, even as the man protested that this whole plan was way too vague. The two of them wished him a final farewell, and as he was sent off, all he could think about was how this strange pair and their even stranger mistake had led to his brand new life. His second life started with a jolt. He woke up wrapped in bandages, covered in wounds, gasping for breath. A man with a thick mustache sitting close by called him Gia, and it hit him. That must be the name of the person whose body he was in. The man looked shocked to see him awake, while our guy wondered if he really was this Gia person now. All at once, a flood of information about this new world poured into his mind, hitting him with a splitting headache. The man beside him noticed and asked, panicked, if he was okay. Through the pain, the memories told him this man was Uncle Otto's. Otto's looked at him with tears in his eyes and said the name Gia again. Overcome with emotion, the uncle pulled him into a tight hug, crying with relief, thanking the heavens he was still alive. The uncle told him his brother and sister were already gone, and that he didn't know what he'd have done if he'd lost Gia too. Hearing that, the young man looked down at his own hand and realized he really had taken over the body of someone who died just moments earlier. A wave of guilt washed over him for stepping into the place of someone so loved. The uncle wiped his tears and asked if his body felt alright, mentioning that the Empire's men had left him with some brutal wounds, so he needed to be careful. The young man noticed his wounds closing up at an impossible speed right before his eyes, but he decided to keep that little secret from his uncle, who was busy checking on his recovery. The uncle urged him to get moving since they had somewhere urgent to be, and it came out that this young man was next in line to lead the Bluemont tribe, a people currently resisting the Vaffencrow Empire. When they reached a military camp, the uncle thanked the soldiers for arranging a meeting with the emperor so they could apologize for the clan's recent rebellion against imperial rule. That rebellion had ultimately failed, leaving its defeated leaders to face the full weight of the throne. Emperor Gordius III of the Waffenclaw Empire demanded to know if the survivors had any excuse at all for what they'd done. Bowing low, the uncle pinned the entire blame on the former chieftain, Noel, insisting the clan had been forced into a battle they never wanted, and begged for the Brummond clan to be spared. The emperor zeroed in on the young man and ordered him to lift his head. Without any warning, the emperor drove a brutal kick into the boy's face, sending him reeling. The emperor mocked their plea for mercy, calling them arrogant barbarians worth less than livestock, while the uncle looked on in horror. A man named Munno tried to step in and stop the violence, but the emperor shut him down, as the uncle kept desperately begging forgiveness forgiveness for his injured nephew. The emperor said the disruption of imperial peace could never be forgiven, but claimed he had no interest in spilling any more blood than necessary. Instead, he offered a path to atonement. The tribe would dedicate their lives and blood to serving the empire. The uncle accepted, head bowed, even as the guards around them jeered. Later, as they walked away, the uncle apologized for tarnishing the memory of the boy's parents, calling them villains, just to keep the tribe alive. The young man was haunted by memories of the brutal fight where his people had been slaughtered and bound by the invading forces. He remembered his father's final moments in the middle of that carnage, the image sitting strangely next to a simple memory of a flower. In that memory, a much younger him had asked his father why the empire called them barbarians, and learned it was simply because the outsiders couldn't understand their language. His father had explained that the empire looked down on every other people as inferior, but insisted their own tribe's culture and way of life were every bit as valid as their oppressors. The memory ended with his father hoping that one day they'd break free of imperial rule and build a land of their own. Back in the present, the weight of those memories, mixed with the humiliation of the moment, finally brought the young man to tears. When his uncle noticed and asked if he was physically hurt, the boy stayed defiant, denying his pain even as he struggled to hold back his emotions. Gaia felt a deep anger rising over the deaths of his parents and his people, questioning why they had to suffer just for being labeled barbarians, and realizing the whole situation was just wrong. Thinking back on a distant memory, he noted he'd never felt emotions this strong before and concluded these feelings were his own, not just something left over from Gaia's original heart. Back in the present, Gaia vowed he'd never forgive the empire, fist clenched, tears in his eyes. And as he claimed that resolve as his own, his companion agreed. Being powerless really was humiliating. Standing together, the man told Gaia they needed to grow stronger to survive, and the boy accepted that without hesitation. Inside a small cabin, a group of tribesmen sat in shock, asking Athos if he was really serious about his latest proposal. Athos confirmed it. He intended to make Gaia the next chieftain, a decision that surprised the young man himself, though Athos stood firmly behind it. The others questioned whether the boy was too young for such a burden, suggesting Athos would make a better leader for the tribe instead. Athos held his ground, saying he believed in Gaia's leadership, and asked the group to back the boy as he stepped into this new role. Recognizing how firm his conviction was, the men eventually agreed to trust his judgment. Later, in private, Gaia asked if he was really the right choice given his lack of experience, which got a laugh out of the older man who found the honesty pretty reasonable. Athos remembered Gaia's father as a brave man, passionate about Brahman's future, who'd always wanted to stand by his brother's side. He admitted that even though Gaia was young and different from his father, he was still asking for forgiveness, placing all his hopes on the boy's shoulders. He finished by simply asking Gaia to let him believe in him, leaving the boy with a look of serious determination. Walking alone, Gaia thought about how some reckless god had dropped him into this awful situation, one that had felt at first like a nightmare he couldn't wake up from. He decided that since he had nothing left to lose by starting from the bottom, he'd do whatever it took to live up to the expectations of the people who believed in him. Resolving to bring the empire down, he declared he'd wear the label of Barbarian like a badge of honor. Gaia then tried out one of the abilities the god had given him as an apology, and was startled when a strange object, a smartphone, actually appeared in front of him. He found he could physically touch the interface, wondering how it worked, and figured the god who gave it to him probably had no real clue about actual technology. The device turned out to be a high-level information terminal, packed with detailed maps and data on plants, animals, and natural resources. Gaia realized a map this good was priceless in this world, and just as he found a category for tracking people, Athos startled him by walking up and asking if he needed anything. Athos asked the young man to help repair a wall the Imperials had destroyed, while the boy realized his floating screen made it look like he was just staring off into thin air. Athos and a companion noted the repairs were going well, and the wall would soon be back to normal. They talked about how badly they needed money to buy wheat since the Imperials had wrecked their storehouse, and their own fields weren't enough on their own. Gaia thought about how the Bluemont tribe lived in forested land with barely any farmable ground, forcing them to buy goods from outside. He understood that most of the fertile land belonged to the empire, and trading with them meant using actual currency instead of simple barter. While hunting for a way to fund the empire's downfall, Gaia spotted a vein of rock salt on his map close to a mineral deposit. He was surprised to find it, realizing this whole region must have once been part of an ocean way back in the past. Knowing salt was a high high-value item always in demand, he figured he could sell the rock salt since pulling salt from seawater was way too much trouble. He decided to check out the site since it was close to the village, but wondered why nobody else had noticed such a valuable deposit before. His investigation got cut short when a massive bear suddenly appeared and let out a deafening roar. Running from the beast, he finally understood why the vein had gone undiscovered. Monsters like this were exactly the reason. He checked his device to identify the creature as a bloody bear and figured the danger level was manageable enough to draw his weapon. His attempt to take it down failed. His sword just bounced off its hide and he barely dodged a counterattack from its claws. Back at the settlement, Otto's was horrified to learn the boy had wandered into bloody bear territory, calling him lucky to have come back unhurt. Gaia quietly used a healing ability on himself while the villagers explained that the bear's hide was way too tough for normal swords to cut through. Gaia decided to give up on the salt for now, while Otto's asked why he'd gone into such a dangerous stretch of forest in the first place. He explained that even as a figurehead chief, he genuinely wanted to find something useful, something that could help the village get the money they needed. His companions were shocked to hear such selfless words from Gaia, since he usually only seemed to care about his own combat training. The group joked about just letting Otto's handle the negotiating, before mentioning that the tribe already had its own specific trade. They looked at their weapons and admitted the tribe made its living through mercenary work. A woman announced to the group that it was time to move against the Algia's kingdom, and a man grumbled that even though he hated working for the empire, they'd still do the job they were paid for. As the group geared up, one man told a girl to kill the enemy before she got hit, while others realized they didn't have enough weapons or working armor to actually go to war. A young man pointed out that everyone was ready to fight since it was finally the tribe's time to earn, right as Otto's showed up to announce a new delivery had arrived. The men burst into excitement when a crate was pried open, revealing a fresh batch of swords ready to use. Surprised by the new gear, the boy asked where the money had come from, and Otto's explained he'd talked their employer into putting something together for them. Otto's revealed the empire was throwing in food and an advance payment, which made Geyer admit he'd expected to be used and tossed aside without any real compensation. As it stood, Emperor Goldius III's endless wars had left him with a constant shortage of good soldiers, despite all the land and slaves those wars had won. Otto's explained that even though the tribe had lost to the empire before, they now had real leverage, since the empire desperately needed them as mercenaries. After getting praised for his leadership, Otto's told Gaia to pick out a new weapon, since he'd wrecked his old sword fighting that bloody bear. Gaia looked the sword over closely, realizing he was finally starting to understand something that had puzzled him about their gear before. He figured the weapons were probably made of bronze, an easy alloy of copper and tin that resisted rust, but still fell short of other metals like iron. Gaia compared bronze to iron, noting the Imperials used iron gear, but there was no local demand for it since it simply wasn't traded in their region. He concluded his failure to pierce the bear's hide had come down to weapon quality, though iron was still way too expensive for them to get their hands on. As Gaia wondered whether they could eventually afford iron weapons with enough money, Otto's came over with a strategic idea for the coming war. Believing the scale of the conflict was too big for their tribe alone, Otto's proposed calling on neighboring tribes to bulk up their forces. A wave of serious reinforcements rolled into camp, marking the start of a coalition between several groups. Warriors of all kinds, elves, members of a reptilian race, and more joined the ranks as tribes kept pouring in. Gaia was stunned by the massive turnout as Otto's pointed out the Anglo, Bandar, and Great Lizard tribes, noting that the promise of money has a way of bringing everyone together. Otto's explained that Bluemont would be leading the charge and told Gaia to go greet the new arrivals, since he'd be playing a big part in the campaign. An elf archer stood ready among the swelling army as the different tribes prepared to march out for the fight ahead. The boy was struck by the girl's beauty right away, though his admiration turned to confusion when she started speaking in a language he couldn't understand at all. Realizing he had no idea what she was saying, he wondered if they even shared a language, but that thought got cut short by a sudden, sharp pain in his head that left him crouched on the ground. As a flood of elven language poured into his mind, he remembered being told he wouldn't have language problems, though the process itself felt like his skull was splitting open, all while the girl checked to see if he was okay. Recovering from the shock, he quickly apologized for the scare, which surprised her even more since he was suddenly speaking her language perfectly. Their conversation got interrupted by the the arrival of a massive lizard-like warrior, demanding to know where he could find someone named Gaia. Introducing himself as Rosso, chief of the Great Lizard Tribe, the warrior explained he was looking for the commander of the Bluemont forces to offer a formal greeting. To the chief's surprise, the boy identified himself as Gaia and welcomed the tribe, and the two leaders shook hands while the girl watched quietly. Rosso teased Gaia about his small size, joking he wasn't even worth eating, banter the girl found completely ridiculous right before the chief turned his attention to her. The chief brought up the elves' reputation for being isolationists who refused to speak the common tongue or trade with anyone, calling them hard to read. Introducing herself as Jessica, niece of the elven chief, she snapped back that her people simply chose not to use the common language, brushing off his complaints about their trade habits. Jessica insisted Elven was simply the more beautiful, superior language, an argument Rosso laughed off while Gaia realized this alliance was already getting complicated. Looking over the strange mix of warriors gathered before him, Gaia couldn't help but think this was a pretty mismatched alliance. Before he could dwell on it, a man approached to tell Gaia the troops were finally ready to march. Gaia felt like he hadn't even finished his introductions but was told there'd be plenty of time on the long road ahead, and the order went out for the whole army to move. As the caravan and soldiers began their trek through the mountain pass, Gaia realized he was truly heading into his very first real battlefield. The journey led them toward the Puros Plain, a huge stretch of land at the base of the mountains in the southeastern corner of the Algia's kingdom. This contested border region, usually full of wheat fields in peacetime, was now overrun with soldiers as a commander called his troops to attention. The imperial commander declared their one goal was to crush the Algia's kingdom's forces and take the Puros Plain back for the empire. He stressed the land rightfully belonged to the Veritacoris Empire, and that capturing it would serve as a staging ground to show their enemies exactly how powerful they were. As the soldiers cheered for their ruler's victory, Gaia noted just how popular the emperor was, despite his reputation for aggressively invading his neighbors to expand his territory. Gaia looked at the man in front of him, realizing that while this guy was clearly a person of high caliber, he was also the target of his revenge, and told himself, just endure it for the sake of the job. The commander told the army that taking this land would help Prince Muno in his fight against the south, which got the mercenaries questioning the prince's leadership. General Hibitius ordered everyone back to their positions to wait for a signal, prompting Gaia to ask where his group should go. Imperial soldiers muttered insults about the mercenaries, wondering if they even understood the language, while the general laughed off the mention of them being northern barbarians. The general told Gaia that since their fighting style didn't match the army's formations, they should just provide support from the side. Back at their camp, Gaia and his companions realized the general had basically told them, politely, to stay out of the way. The mercenaries mocked the imperial army for their slow, shield wall tactics, comparing them to turtles and remembering how they'd once lost to a force that slow. They talked about how hard it was to coordinate between tribes, since some of them didn't understand the imperial language or orders at all. While the others joked about potential infighting, a man told Gaia to stop overthinking things, since as Bluemont tribe members, they'd fight and die with honor. Gaia thought about how that exact mindset had gotten his parents killed and figured that even in this line of work, it was better if fewer people died. Looking at his screen, he admitted he had no intention of sparing enemies on the battlefield, but he still wanted to keep the deaths of his fellow barbarians to a minimum. He acknowledged that goal might be a bit much to ask for, but reminded himself they were here to earn money and kept studying his device. Gaia was suddenly interrupted by something on his screen and looked up to see a magical disturbance nearby. Imperial soldiers, startled by a sudden blast, blamed the mercenaries, while a young elf girl stood with her hand out looking furious. The soldiers called her a crazy barbarian and mocked her intelligence, assuming she couldn't even understand what they were saying. Furious, she demanded an apology for their comments about elves and slaves, leaving the soldiers confused about why she was so angry. The men dismissed it, claiming they just wanted to play with her, and reminded her that in the Empire, all of her kind were considered slaves. Gaia rushed in, calling out her name, Jessica, and telling her to calm down and explain what happened. Gaia introduced himself as a mercenary of the Bluemont tribe in flawless Imperial, surprising Jessica, while the soldiers mocked them both as beasts. Gaia stepped in front of Jessica to apologize for her dangerous behavior but made it clear he had no interest in hearing their slander either. Standing in front of the guards, the man declared they'd come to this battlefield as soldiers, but if all they were seen as was barbarians, they'd respond with barbarian courtesy, a bit of defiance that left the men around him stunned. The tension broke when a superior ordered everyone back to their posts, saying it was no time for trouble, while the elf girl watched Gaia with real concern as the soldiers backed off. Without warning, Gaia reached out and grabbed the elf girl's hands, catching her completely off guard and leaving her stunned. He urgently asked her about the earlier explosion, whether she'd caused it, and whether all elves could use magic. Jessica confirmed plenty of elves could use magic, and guessed the Empire probably had magic soldiers of its own too, which sent Gaia straight into a barrage of tactical questions about the range and limits of their spells. Unable to give him a solid answer, she suggested he go talk to her uncle instead, while the other elf girl sighed in disbelief at his relentless intensity. Gaia soon got an audience with the elven tribe's chief, Alanif, who wanted to know why someone from the barbarian tribe cared so much about the details of elven magic soldiers. Blunt about it, Gaia admitted he was after the full cooperation of the elves for the coming battle. He explained the barbarian tribe didn't have enough strength on its own, but said he'd worked out a strategy to make up for it. While admitting it was tradition for each tribe to fight however they wanted, Gaia argued that if his plan worked, both the barbarians and the elves would come out ahead. Alanif said he'd already heard about the earlier scuffle from Jessica and told the young man to explain his idea before they went any further. The chief noted that since this man spoke their language and treated them like comrades, the elves would return that respect in kind. After hearing Gaia ask for help one more time, Alanif reminded him they were mercenaries fighting for pay, but agreed he was curious to hear the terms of the proposal. Satisfied with how the talk had gone, Gaia gave a cheerful wave goodbye, leaving the elf girls behind, watching him go with a mix of annoyance and amusement. In the land of Pyros, the stage was being set for a massive display of the Empire's power. A huge military force gathered under the banner of the Empire, claiming to bring righteous rule in the Emperor's name. The ranks of the Imperial army stood ready, shields and spears raised, waiting for the order to move out. A commander on horseback addressed his loyal warriors, calling on the god of war to protect them as they prepared to march. Watching from their side, Gaia and his allies stayed quiet and focused as they braced for the fight ahead. With a fierce command, the leader ordered his soldiers to advance, and war horns echoed across the battlefield. A solid wall of heavy shields locked into place as the first volley of arrows slammed into the front line. Seeing the incoming barrage, a commander on horseback ordered his troops to keep their shields raised against the archers. In response, the magic soldiers were told to throw up a defensive barrier while the first line of archers got ready to strike back. The battlefield erupted in explosions as projectiles slammed into the defensive line, forcing soldiers to hunker down behind their round shields. As the first blood was drawn, a beastman let out a deafening roar, signaling the war had officially begun. The big lizard tribe led the charge, followed by mercenaries eager to turn the chaos of battle into profit. Watching the main force head out, a group of companions asked Ottos if staying behind was really the right call, but Gaia stayed calm, telling them everything was fine. Holding up his glowing device, Gaia confidently announced it was time for their group to join the fight. The regular soldiers looked on, confused, as Gaia and his small team broke formation and headed off in an unexpected direction. The infantry wrote them off as barbarians who didn't understand the battlefield, even as a group of elves fell in behind Gaia. Gaia told his skeptical team they'd flank the enemy and get as close as possible. He shocked his companions by revealing his real goal, taking the head of the Kingdom Army's commander right now. When asked how he could possibly know the commander's location, Gaia explained he had a god's eye view of the whole battlefield. Meanwhile, the Beastman warrior watched the wide horizon as the two armies kept closing the distance. Inside a secure tent, high-ranking officials relaxed with wine, chatting about how their devoted warriors were ready to die for the cause. They credited their guaranteed victory to the Emperor's divine greatness, and the leader laughed at how easy the coming slaughter would be. The mood shifted a little when someone asked for the Emperor's own thoughts on the matter, leaving the leader sitting in quiet contemplation. Far from the main camps, Gaia led his small group in a sprint across the open plains, putting his plan into motion. His allies still doubted this looked like a suicide mission, but Gaia revealed his secret weapon, real-time battlefield intel straight from his smartphone. Tracking the Kingdom Army's formation on his screen, he spotted a gap in the forest that would lead them right to the vulnerable commander. The plan relied on a quick surprise strike followed by an immediate pullback, since their foot soldiers couldn't match the speed and power of the commander's cavalry once it regrouped. While some talked up the honor of the Bluemont tribe fighting like wolves, the real focus stayed on a surgical magical strike aimed only at the enemy commander. They figured killing the commander would throw the kingdom's chain of command into chaos, letting the Empire seize the advantage while keeping casualties down. Despite the risks, the group got ready to move out, locking in their resolve for the operation ahead. Otto's decided to put his trust in Gaia and follow him into battle, and that convinced the rest of the hesitant soldiers to join in too. The veterans admitted that while the old chieftain had been wild, this new leader was proving just as untamed and just as determined. On the front lines, a massive magical explosion rocked the battlefield, soldiers bracing behind their shields against the shockwave. The commander rallied his troops to shore up their defense and look for an opening, assuring them their magic barriers would hold against the enemy's limited ammunition. His officers found the noise and light of the magic irritating, but admitted it was still a powerful tool, one only a few gifted people could counter with barriers of their own. They discussed the slim chance of magic slipping past a barrier and agreed that even if they held back from using such tactics, the enemy certainly wouldn't. A scout reported that things at the front were still evenly matched, with both sides holding roughly equal strength. The commander decided to hold his cavalry back to avoid a counterattack, resigned to the idea that this battle was going to drag on past a single day. Suddenly, word came in that a unit of barbarian mercenaries on the right flank had broken formation and fled into the nearby forest. Writing off their supposed bravery as just a rumor, the commander looked toward the forest and demanded the exact direction they'd deserted in. He demanded an immediate detailed report on where the deserters were headed, needing to keep control over his flank. Deep in the forest, the mustache man commented on how impressed he was by Gaia's skill negotiating with the elves for this secret operation. The group was suddenly caught off guard by Rosso's arrival, Gaia realizing the great lizard tribe had gotten involved in the mission without him even knowing. Rosso explained he'd sensed something was up the moment he saw them heading in such a strange direction, which earned him a compliment for his sharp instincts. As they closed in on their target, Gaia used a tracking ability to confirm the enemy commander was exactly where they'd expected. Knowing that fighting mounted enemies head-on was tough, Gaia planned to have the elves use magic to break their formation first, though some of the soldiers doubted how accurate the strike could really be. The elf warned their magic would be wasted if it hit the barrier, but the man insisted it'd be fine, as long as they aimed exactly where he told them to. Pointing off into the distance, the man identified a gap in the enemy's defenses just as the opposing soldiers started to realize something was wrong. A sudden ambush caught the mounted troops off guard as warriors led by a lizardman charged into their ranks with a fierce battle cry. The enemy commander tried to hold his panicked troops together, ordering them to form up since they were only facing infantry. A massive magical blast tore through the middle of the battlefield, throwing the whole defensive line into total chaos. The soldiers were stunned that their barrier had been bypassed, realizing with dread that the magic had struck a gap they'd figured was just a coincidence. Another explosion rocked the field, leaving the cavalry screaming in confusion, struggling to understand how they were being hit so accurately. The man immediately ordered a Lanif to target the right flank next, leaving his companions stunned that he could hit those barrier gaps so quickly, one after another. While his allies wondered how he could possibly see the barriers from so far away, the man just noted the way was finally open and told them to aim for the commander. With a fierce shout, the man ordered the barbarian mercenary squad to charge, and the unit rushed into the fray. Despite the blood and chaos, the enemy leader urged his men to stay calm and fight back against attackers he still dismissed as mere infantry. The lizardman warrior mocked the struggling soldiers, daring them to climb down off their horses and face him on the ground. A man with a fur collar pushed the squad deeper into the fight, saying the commander was further in, while the young man ran toward his target. After checking several riders and finding they weren't his target, the man finally spotted the enemy leader and smiled as the general tried to order a full withdrawal. Locking eyes on the retreating general, the man declared the commander was now his prey. As the general shouted for a retreat, the man suddenly lunged at him, catching the soldier completely by surprise. The force of the strike was enough to knock the commander clean off his horse and onto the ground. The man introduced himself as Gaia of the barbarian mercenary squad, and the general identified himself as Pausania of the Algia's kingdom, both of them vowing to kill the other. A lizardman named Rosso jumped into the fight, urging Gaia to finish the job and take the commander's head right then. Enraged at being challenged by someone he considered infantry scum, General Pausania glared at Gaia as the standoff reached its breaking point. Realizing the huge gap in weapon reach, the man decided he had to risk everything and close the distance if he wanted any hope of striking back. He lunged forward recklessly, only to be run through the chest by the mounted soldier's long spear. The horseman mocked him for such a foolish charge, but his laughter turned to shock when the man ignored the wound and grabbed the spear to pull himself in even closer. After dragging the commander off his horse, he delivered the finishing blow while apologizing for the desperate move, leaving the dying officer to realize he'd been lured into taking both of them down together. Despite bleeding heavily, the young man stood over his fallen enemy and coldly said he was the only one staying dead. A lizardman rushed over to check on him, and though he was coughing up blood, he insisted he was fine, as long as the enemy commander was truly finished. Gaia immediately started shouting across the battlefield that General Pausania of the Algia's kingdom had been slain by the barbarian mercenary squad. Word of the general's death sent shock through the ranks, and the remaining Algia's soldiers felt the sting of being beaten by mere infantry. Unable to face their crown prince after such a disgrace, the enemy cavalry grew desperate and ordered a full slaughter of the mercenary group. Facing a sudden encirclement, the mercenary commander ordered his men to fall back and retreat into the safety of the nearby forest. Just as things looked bleak, a powerful unit of heavy cavalry charged into the fray and started cutting down the pursuing enemy forces. Both the young man and Gaia watched in confusion as the tide of the battle shifted in an instant. The mercenaries realized they'd just been saved and started following the new cavalry, who turned out to be the Empire's own soldiers. An Imperial officer acknowledged the mercenary squad's hard work as he rode past the stunned young man. Watching the Imperial banners wave in the wind, the mercenary leader hoped their part in this would earn them a very generous reward. With the fighting finally over, the young man sat down on the grass to rest while his allies gathered around to check on him. The battlefield was soon littered with the abandoned gear and high-quality weapons of the defeated Algia's army. The mercenaries were thrilled to claim the spoils of war, though the young man wondered if they were actually allowed to keep the enemy's equipment. His commander reassured him that the dead had no use for treasure, noting the Battle of the Pyros Plains had been settled in just a single day. Without a leader, the Algia's kingdom's forces were completely routed by the Veritacoris Empire, a crushing victory where the spoils went to whoever secured the kill. The Imperial army started handing out supplies, including high-quality gear that had once belonged to the soldiers of the Algia's kingdom. While the young man was thanking them for the gear, his uncle excitedly showed off an iron sword, pointing out how much better it was than their usual poor equipment. The man explained iron weapons were rare and expensive on the market, since they were usually reserved for Imperial soldiers only. As Otto's and a companion looked on, Gaia examined the blade and thought about the constant struggle just to scrape together enough money for things like this. He remembered the bloody bear whose fur had shrugged off bronze weapons and figured this iron sword would finally give him a fair shot against it. Gaia noticed Rosso had gotten new equipment too, but was shocked when the lizardman just casually tossed the iron weapon aside. Rosso said he preferred his bronze weapon since it was shinier and looked better, leaving Gaia frustrated by the sheer lack of logic in that. The lizardman argued iron was plain and rusted too easily, while Gaia insisted iron weapons were actually the ones that looked cool and stood out. A man showed up with horses for the group and asked where they should be tied up as everyone got ready for the next leg of the journey. Gaia was horrified when the lizardman started eyeing the horses like a meal, but a woman cut in and told him to go wash the blood off his body. As he walked off, Gaia grumbled about how the lizard folk kept wasting perfectly good iron weapons just because they stuck to what they already knew. He noticed his own wounds had healed in a way that made no sense, and figured he'd have to tell the others the blood on his clothes belonged to the enemy. Looking back on the battle, Gaia admitted it had felt like someone else's memories were moving his body, which was how he'd ended up walking straight into a lethal stab. He accepted his own monstrous nature as just a means to prove the Empire wrong, before noticing someone else nearby at the water. Gaia accidentally stumbled on a girl bathing in the forest and froze in place, realizing his mistake. The girl noticed him and calmly asked if he'd come to wash up too, warning him the water was cold. Panicking, Gaia dropped into a formal kneeling bow to apologize for accidentally seeing her. He begged for forgiveness and offered to leave right away, but she said she wasn't angry and told him to act more confident. Once the tension settled, Gaia started washing up but noticed the girl was watching him with an intense, unwavering gaze. She pointed to a large scar on his back and asked if he'd been hurt, and Gaia simply confirmed the injury. Standing by the water, the woman questioned his decision to serve the Empire after everything that happened to the broom Rumund tribe, though he made clear his allegiance wasn't so simple. She brought up the rumor that the Empire had killed his parents, the previous chieftains, asking how he could calmly serve the very people responsible for their deaths. He snapped that he was far from okay with any of it, then quickly reined in his anger and quietly apologized for the outburst. Turning away, she admitted her fellow elves often brushed off the loss of her parents and comrades as unavoidable, while he listened in silence. Despite putting on a face of acceptance, she struggled to hold back the deep frustration she felt about the tragedy. Apologizing for getting so heavy, she told him to dry off before the cold water got to him and he sank back into the river. Elsewhere, a mercenary group prepared to move out, nodding the Imperial Army's habit of working them hard and focused simply on earning their pay. A man with a mustache explained their next stop was a simultaneous assault on another front, one he suspected might turn out to be the real battlefield. The target was Kalan Castle, a key stronghold in the southern Algius kingdom. The siege was already underway, soldiers scaling the walls under a barrage of stones and arrows while those below struggled to keep their footing. As the sun set, the order came to pull back for the night, ending the day's assault on the fortress. Back at camp, merchants took the chance to sell food and cheap drinks to the returning soldiers. The young man remarked to his uncle how lively the place felt, nodding it was nothing like their time in Pyros. The uncle explained that merchants usually flocked to war zones, but the previous fighting had been too brief to draw them in. Deciding to report their arrival, they headed toward the main camp to make it official. The guards at the gate dismissively waved them through as the Barbarian mercenary corps, assuming their trip from Pyros had been easy enough. Passing through the inner camp, the young man felt uneasy, sensing something about the festive mood just felt wrong. A guard warned them to mind their manners before entering a tent, and the young man got hit with a wave of perfume just as he bumped into a woman. Inside, a group of elegant women mockingly commented on how young he looked, before announcing to their superior that visitors had arrived. Seated among the women, Crown Prince Muno of the Veritacoris Empire looked on with indifference, saying he had no memory of inviting any guests. The Barbarian mercenary corps arrived from Pyros to pay their respects to the Crown Prince. The prince immediately threw his cup at the older man's head and wrote off the mercenaries as nothing but a nuisance. Relaxing with several women, the prince demanded they stop bothering him with pointless reports while he was resting. Insulting their lack of military manners, the prince ordered the group thrown out, and the man held Gaia back and led them away. When they asked for deployment orders, a confused soldier just told the mercenaries to find any open spot and set up their own camp. The soldier explained that Kalan Castle was already surrounded, and there was no need to rush the attack since the kingdom would surrender soon anyway. The man asked if a ship was being sent out at this hour, but the soldier said he had no idea what he was talking about. The soldier pointed out that no ship would be moving at night without lights, which left the man figuring he must have just seen it wrong. Noticing the lack of discipline around camp, the young man complained that the Imperial Army was way too slack for a real battlefield. While Gaia doubted the Crown Prince's ability to command anything, the older man asked if he'd noticed anything strange on their way in. Gaia admitted he hadn't seen it with his own eyes, but suspected a ship might have shown up on his smartphone. Walking away from camp, the older man suddenly voiced his worry that the Imperial Army might actually lose this fight. Looking out at the distant fortress, the young man asked what was behind such a grim prediction. The situation turned into a nightmare as Algius Kingdom soldiers launched a massive surprise attack on the Imperial positions. Amid the panic, the prince demanded to know why the easy enemy was winning, while the mercenaries got ready to retreat as planned. Gaia stared at the chaos unfolding, realizing this incoming force wasn't an enemy they could actually beat. The story jumped back a few days to a bustling marketplace full of travelers and tents. Walking through the food stalls, the lizardmen soaked up the atmosphere while the others found it hard to believe a war was even happening nearby. Gaia noted that with 20,000 soldiers camped there, all these merchants made the place feel more like a festival than a war zone. The girl argued that so many merchants gathering was actually a sign the war was dragging on, though the lizardman was only thinking about the food. At the military camp, the lizardman complained about how boring the battlefield was despite the decent food, while an elf pointed out they'd only been sent as reinforcements for a short-handed army. Ignoring the stalled front lines, the lizardman figured hanging out with Gaia at the market was a much better use of their time. Jessica tried to justify tagging along by claiming she needed to keep an eye on the tribal chieftains, but the lizardman quickly saw through it. She just wanted to stay close to Gaia. She denied it as they walked through the market market, though the group leader reminded everyone they were there strictly for supplies, not for fun. The group made their way through the crowded rows of merchant tents, while a mysterious hooded man watched them pass with a smile. Noticing the range of goods and the lax security, the group wondered if the merchants were actually from the Empire, and the lizardmen stopped to check out a specific stall. They found large, colorful fruits the young man identified as oranges, though the lizardman admitted he'd never seen anything like them before. A merchant offered them a sample of the fresh southern fruit, and the young man asked if they were traders from the Algius kingdom. He correctly picked out the man's imperial accent and the woman's kingdom accent, earning an impressed laugh from the merchant for such a sharp ear. The man introduced himself as Karanos from the Algius kingdom, explaining that merchants followed trade routes regardless of borders and that he had proper permits to prove it. Both the lizardman and the elf were won over instantly by the taste of the fruit, and Karanos suggested they try the watermelons next. While talking about how long the produce could last, Karanos mentioned they could even reach barbarian settlements deep in the Empire, a phrase that immediately put the young man on edge. Karanos clarified he'd simply guessed they were a mercenary unit from the Northern Empire, given how mixed their races were, a guess the young man admitted was spot on. The young man asked for a large order of light, long-lasting rations for their whole unit, and the merchant agreed to prepare it, though he hesitated for just a moment. Karanos guessed the group was planning an early departure, but the young man brushed off the suspicion, claiming he was just being cautious about supplies. The merchant promised to call for them once the big order was ready, and the group started moving away from the stall. Watching from a distance, the lizardman noted the merchant moved like a trained fighter, which led the young man to conclude the man wasn't really a merchant at all. He suspected the man was a soldier or a spy for the Algius kingdom, unsettled by how easily he'd been able to read them as outsiders. Jessica was caught off guard by the idea that the Imperial army was already in a hopeless spot, quietly preparing for a retreat. As they discussed the possible defeat, the man with the mustache asked for more details, mentioning he'd spotted a ship heading toward Kalon Castle. The group talked over the mysterious ship spotted at night, nodding the Empire would have no reason to send vessels out at that hour, a detail the man they just met had somehow missed. The young man guessed the ship might be a supply vessel from the Algius kingdom, while the older man weighed the situation at Kalon Castle, where the Imperial army's overwhelming numbers should have already forced its surrender. The man explained that if supplies were getting through, it meant critical information was reaching the kingdom too, and the defenders would just keep holding out for reinforcements, making it impossible for the Imperial army to take the castle. Thinking back, the boy remembered that Karanos had offered to prepare their supplies, which lined up with his uncle's read on that ship heading toward the castle. He realized that if the kingdom had already secured a transport route, reinforcements would be arriving anytime now. The group recognized they needed to prepare for a retreat, since the Imperial army probably wouldn't back them up during a withdrawal, leaving them to wonder if the Empire even realized how badly things had shifted. Despite her obvious frustration, the warrior pointed out they were still obligated to warn the Empire, since technically these people were their employers. The lizardman insisted that as mercenaries hired for money, they had a professional duty to fulfill, whether or not anyone listened to their advice, a point Gaia and the young man eventually accepted. When they brought the news, the commander found the idea of the Imperial army losing simply unthinkable, insisting their superior numbers would guarantee victory as long as they kept up the siege. The young man asked whether a few supply ships could really turn the tide, but the debate got cut short when an official arrived to berate the commander and summon him to see His Highness. The commander warned them he was powerless to help, since the supreme leader Muno only wanted to hear reports of absolute victory, no matter what was actually happening on the ground. As the official kept yelling and demanding results, the other soldiers brushed off the group's warnings as ridiculous claims from a bunch of barbarians, laughing off the idea of losing. Afraid of their leader's temper, the soldiers hurried off to attend to their duties. Back at the supply area, the merchant Karanos confirmed all the requested food and packing materials were ready, and the group got set to pay him in imperial silver and horses. The boy explained they were selling the horses since they were too expensive to keep, and the merchant agreed to buy the Algius-bred animals at a fair price. After talking about how durable mountain donkeys were on rough terrain, the older man asked if the merchant could handle their supply needs going forward, but the man revealed he was planning to leave. The merchant explained his business and his spying were both done since he'd already sent the intelligence on the Empire he needed to, and he he told them reinforcements should arrive within days before saying his goodbyes. As the merchant pointed out, it'd be worth building ties with the Algius kingdom to lean less on the empire, the young man weighed the kingdom's history as a major power with a long-standing grudge. The man said he was glad to have connected with the Balbal tribe, calling them interesting business partners, and hoped they'd meet again once the fighting was over. They sealed the deal with a handshake, promising to host the merchant if he ever came to visit. Back at camp, the various tribes had finally come around to the plan being proposed. Inside a tent, the young man declared their job was done, and it was time to just watch how the battle played out. Another man noted that taking advance payment made planning a retreat feel a little awkward. The young man held firm, saying they wouldn't take the fall for the Empire's losses, and hoped his uncle's worries would turn out to be nothing. Near the coast, a man focused on his mission of getting a mercenary unit safely back home, while a subordinate reported to the Crown Prince that all units had arrived. Standing ready with his horse, the commander prepared to lead his gathered forces. On watch, a relaxed guard admitted to his buddy that he was exhausted after drinking too much the day before. As his fellow guard kept bragging about some woman he'd met, the man suddenly spotted movement in the distance and pointed out a large group approaching. A massive army appeared on the horizon, leaving the guards wondering if these were the reinforcements they'd been expecting or something far stranger. Chaos broke out instantly when an arrow struck the camp and the soldiers realized they were under a surprise enemy attack. A commander shouted for his troops to stop panicking and hold steady, as a scout reported the Argius kingdom's army was closing in fast from the north. He first demanded they meet the enemy head-on with their superior numbers, but was left stunned when told enemy ships were also closing in from the sea, boxing them in from both sides. Realizing just how desperate things had gotten, the commander ordered an immediate report be sent to the Crown Prince to await further orders. Back at camp, the young man took in the commotion and identified the approaching force as the Argius kingdom's army. As his companions suggested making a run for it while they still could, he checked his map and realized they were about to be completely surrounded, on land and sea both. He noted the Empire wasn't losing yet in raw numbers, and started looking for a way to break the encirclement without unnecessary casualties. He told his group to stay ready to move while he went to warn headquarters, but he paused when he saw a portrait of Prince Alex, wondering who could be commanding the enemy with such speed. Looking out over the shore, Prince Alex was informed the encirclement would be complete shortly, and he reflected on how long he'd already kept the people of Kalan waiting. With his army behind him, the prince gave the signal to begin the assault. He ordered his men to trample and ravage the cowards of Veritachoris, and his troops surged forward in a fierce charge. At the Empire's headquarters, a guard reported serious damage from the northern detachment and asked the Crown Prince for orders, only to be met with drunken irritation. The prince hurled his glass and berated his men for being unable to act without direct orders, leaving the young man stunned that he was drinking through such a crisis. Inside the command tent, a commander angrily shut down his subordinate's suggestion to retreat, insisting the troops his father had provided wouldn't be beaten this easily, and blaming the current failure on bad tactics. The commander irritably ordered his men back to their posts, but a young soldier stepped up and respectfully urged His Highness to reconsider and order a withdrawal before it was too late. Surprised by the soldier's boldness, the commander mocked the idea of such a pathetic retreat, while his advisor quietly studied the young man, wondering who he really was. The soldier warned that the enemy moved fast and any missed window would make escape impossible, prompting the advisor to mention the enemy was led by a brilliant general. Tension rose as the soldier revealed the enemy commander was none other than Crown Prince Alex, a name that visibly rattled the troops around them. Known as the ever-victorious Silver Lion, Alex was a legend whose mere presence on a battlefield practically guaranteed victory for his side. The soldiers talked about how Alex had conquered several states in a matter of days, and the advisor warned the prince they were facing a dangerous opponent who demanded a change in strategy. Though the prince feared his father's scolding if he retreated, his advisor cleverly suggested calling it a shift in position, regrouping at Kalan Castle instead, an idea the other soldiers quickly backed. The prince went along with it, telling himself that shifting position to break an encirclement was a totally different thing from a cowardly retreat, and decided he'd better be the first to reach safety. He formally ordered the whole army to shift position from the castle toward Pyros, leaving his subordinates to relay the order to the front lines while some of the men sighed at his leadership. Looking out over the water, observers noted the Empire's retreat was going to be brutal, since they were now being squeezed from the the sea too. As the soldiers prepared to flee along the planned route, a man approached from behind and greeted them casually. The man claimed he'd known this was coming days ago and offered to discuss a deal he believed would benefit both sides. Elsewhere on the battlefield, Prince Alex stayed composed as he kept fighting, assuring a worried subordinate that he was completely unharmed. Alex rallied the soldiers of Algius to push forward and retake Kalan Castle, calling on them to save their fellow countrymen as the troops shouted back their loyalty. Despite the danger, Alex explained he'd only come to the front lines to rally the troops and promised to head back to safety soon. The battle kept going smoothly for his side, confirming reports that the Imperial forces had lost any real chain of command. Looking toward the castle, Alex told his subordinate he wanted to retake it with as few losses as possible, since the people there were a treasure, unlike the war-obsessed emperor of the rival nation. Alex's subordinate noted that the enemy commander was the incompetent crown prince, suggesting that capturing him alive would be a valuable bargaining chip down the road. A scout reported the enemy army was massing toward the highway, leading Alex to conclude they were finally planning a retreat after all. Prince Alex brushed off his soldiers' pleas to stay back and decided to join the fight himself, curious to see the skills of the crown prince of Veritachoris, while his subordinates grumbled about how contradictory he was when it came to war. The sheer scale of everything unfolding left the observers in complete shock. In the middle of the chaos, a man shouted in frustration, wondering if this whole deal was even worth the risk, cursing whoever was responsible for the mess. Elanif was ordered to move right as a path opened through a dark magical vortex, while nearby commanders couldn't believe a supposedly easy battle had turned into a desperate fight for survival. A young man bluntly told the complaining nobles that whining wouldn't save their prince, and they needed to move, and the group reluctantly fell in behind him despite their disdain for his barbarian status. Confusion spread through the ranks as they wondered why the barbarian mercenaries hadn't just pulled out on their own, and whether there was even a way to escape the encirclement now. The panic deepened when they saw the crown prince of Veritachoris withdrawing alongside the mercenaries, and the young man realized the whole operation had been driven by nothing but money. Inside a command tent, a plan was hatched to secretly get the prince out using the mercenaries as cover, leaving the young man wondering if the commander was really okay abandoning his post like that. The commander justified it, saying the prince's presence only led to strange orders, and logically he'd be the main target the moment the enemy realized he was on the field. He pointed out that the barbarians made the perfect disguise to hide the prince's identity, stressing that the top priority was getting him out alive. Fearing execution if he failed, the man promised a huge reward for the prince's safe return, though the mercenaries privately doubted how much his word was actually worth. Despite the danger, the group decided to chase the promised payout, hoping for a reward big enough to justify such a risky job. Studying the map, the young man noted the empire's advance toward Pyros, and guessed the kingdom army had already seen through the plan to break the encirclement. Watching how fast the kingdom responded, he started to suspect the rumors about Prince Alex being a brilliant commander might actually be true. The plan relied on the enemy massing their forces in one spot, thinning their lines elsewhere and opening a small gap for the mercenary band to slip through. By heading into the forest and mountains, they hoped to use the terrain to shake off any pursuit, while praying they could survive long enough to break through the initial fighting. Watching the enemy's positions, the young man was startled to find an unusually large number of kingdom units blocking their intended path. Sensing danger, he shouted for everyone to run before they got cut off by the approaching force. His heart sank as he realized the crown prince of the Algius kingdom had personally come to the front lines to lead the pursuit. Informed that an empire squad was positioned ahead, the prince of Algius refused to take a detour, and with a confident smirk ordered his men to charge straight through. The battlefield turned into pure chaos as armored cavalry charged straight into a line of struggling soldiers. Noticing the crown prince's group getting split up in the confusion, Gaia ignored his uncle's warnings of danger and decided to head back into the fight alone. He insisted their entire mission would be a total loss if the prince died, choosing to prioritize the rescue despite the very real risk of getting killed himself. Nearby, a panicked nobleman screamed for protection as his horse bucked wildly, while his own guards grumbled about having to protect someone so useless. A blonde knight on horseback surveyed the area, noting the enemy's unusual gear matched reports of soldiers from the empire's northern regions. As the survivors kept crying out in fear, the knight drew his blade and prepared to cut down anyone trying to flee. Gaia stepped in at the last possible second, swinging swinging his sword to block the knight's lethal downward strike and shield the fallen men. Locking eyes with his opponent, Gaia realized he was up against a highly skilled unit of native warriors from the far north. He shouted at the dazed survivors to stop standing around and retreat back to the safety of the main force. The knight immediately followed up with another heavy attack, forcing Gaia to give everything he had just to keep from getting overwhelmed. Knowing they were about to get left behind, Gaia listened as the knight coldly noted, no amount of healing magic could save someone from a severed head. Just as the knight moved in for the finishing blow, a sudden, powerful presence on the battlefield made him hesitate. A massive burst of dark energy erupted between the two fighters, forcing the knight back and throwing up a temporary wall of fire. While the flames covered their escape, a hand grabbed Gaia's arm, urging him to take the chance and run before the enemy could recover. Jessica scolded Gaia for his recklessness, demanding to know why a chieftain would charge in alone and put himself in such needless danger. A tall beastman carried the whimpering nobleman off, telling Gaia they needed to clear out while they still had the chance. Across the field, guards rushed to the blonde knight's side, addressing him as Prince Alex and scolding him for wandering off alone again. As a blinding light spell washed over the battlefield, the beastman told Gaia they had to move now, while the enemy's vision was still obscured. Looking back one last time, Gaia finally realized the formidable warrior he'd just been fighting was Prince Alex of Algius. While Jessica urged Gaia to hurry, Prince Alex called off the pursuit, unwilling to risk more casualties against a group that clearly had mages among them. Ordering his troops to reform for another advance, the man brushed off a soldier's plea for him to fall back for his own safety as royalty, focusing instead on the northern tribal unit of the empire he saw up ahead. He recalled a specific group Karanos had mentioned, known as the Barbarian Mercenary Corps, while the mercenaries themselves got ready for their next move. Looking at a digital map, the young man realized they were being surrounded on all sides by Argius troops. Realizing the forest was riddled with hidden ambushes, he noted the enemy had correctly predicted their escape route and would have caught them if not for his map data, much to his companion's amusement. He found the enemy's level of preparation absurd, all just to catch a single mercenary unit, and voiced his growing frustration with the whole situation. A man in the group threw a tantrum about the rough terrain and his dirty feet, loudly demanding a carriage despite them being in the middle of a dense forest. Told a carriage was impossible, the complaining man demanded to be carried on someone's back instead, prompting the mustache guy to suggest they just rest for the day at Gaia's spot. The retreat from Kalan Castle had turned into a total disaster for the Empire's forces, with more than half the soldiers failing to escape the encirclement. While resting, the soldiers talked about how most of the casualties had come from noble imperial families, admitting that personal feelings were starting to complicate the mission. The young man decided to use the situation to their advantage, charging extra for their services and cashing in old favors right as a soldier approached him for a word. A soldier hesitantly asked if they could improve the quality of the meals, since the royal traveling with them wouldn't stop complaining. The royal man refused to eat biscuits and jerky, demanding hot soup and fine drinks instead, leaving the young man visibly stressed. He explained to the soldier that since they were currently on the run, lighting a fire for soup would give away their position and lead the enemy straight to them. Even after being told there were no luxury supplies, the royal man kept screaming in the background, leading the soldier to admit the guy was simply impossible to reason with. To settle things, the young man suggested giving the royal some oranges and watermelons from their supplies as a stand-in for hot soup. Feeling the weight of the royal's demands, the young man confirmed with his companion that they'd definitely be squeezing every bit of payment out of him later for all this trouble. The group kept trudging through the rocky mountain passes while the royal kept voicing his displeasure. After a long journey, the group finally reached the main road and celebrated getting out of the forest. They spotted the town of Pyros in the distance, marking the end of their immediate escape through the wilderness. Seeing the imperial flag still flying over Pyros, the soldiers were relieved the town hadn't fallen, and a local official welcomed the royal back to safety. The scene opened with reports coming in from the battle at Kalan Castle, and a high-ranking official was told that despite the heavy losses, he was lucky to have made it back alive. He immediately launched into complaints about the soldiers being useless and incompetent, having botched what should have been an easy victory. Looking toward Hibiscus, the man asked if he'd been deliberately handed fools to serve under him, while his subordinates tried to stay composed despite the insult. The conversation turned to the Barbarian Mercenary Corps who'd helped him, but he found the idea of traveling alongside such people horrifying and disgusting. He kept ranting about the lack of civilization and proper meals from these savages before demanding the utmost hospitality from Hibiscus, who reluctantly promised to do his best. Meanwhile, at the harbor, the group watched the crown prince set sail for the imperial capital, relieved to be rid of his endless complaining despite the headaches waiting for him back home. A sailor approached the group and asked if they were planning to board the ship, offering them a chance to earn some money on the voyage. He explained that a ship full of important figures had recently left the harbor, taking most of the regular crew along with it. Since they were short-handed on grunt work, the group agreed to help haul cargo, figuring it was an easy way to earn their keep. While the others got excited about the promise of better meals, the young man wondered if the food during the march had really been that bad. The crewman directed them down to the hold to bring supplies to the rowers, sparking a discussion about how this galley was different from the military ships they'd used before. Heading downstairs, the girl noticed a foul smell, and they realized that since this was a rented merchant vessel, the rowers were probably civilians rather than soldiers. Stepping into the hold, they were met with the grim sight of exhausted men tied to their stations, ropes fastened around their necks. The young man stood there in shock, staring at the rowers' bound limbs and miserable condition, asking who these people even were. His companion explained they were slaves the merchant had bought right before a guard barked at the boy to stop starring and get back to work. Suddenly, one of the slaves recognized the older man's accent and identified him as a member of the Bluemont tribe who'd once served with the Barbarian mercenaries. The slave called out to him as Athos, but the man quickly denied knowing him, even as the young man asked his uncle about the recognition. Ignoring the denial, the slave mentioned they'd once fought the Empire together and asked about someone named Noel, until the uncle sternly told him to be quiet. The moment was violently cut short when a guard struck the slave across the head with a wooden club, while the young man and his uncle watched in silence. The guard kept up the brutal assault, screaming that a slave had no right to speak or act without permission, while the man cowered and begged for mercy. A man stepped in to stop the brutal treatment of the captive, only to be met with a harsh order to stay silent. The captor justified his cruelty by claiming complete authority over the slaves, mocking the bystanders as savages. Overwhelmed with rage at the sight of this injustice, Gaia thought seriously about taking the man's life right there on the spot. Before he could act on the impulse, the older man grabbed Gaia's arm and told him to stop. The older man quickly stepped in to defuse the situation, apologizing to the slave master and offering a bribe to excuse his nephew's outburst. The slave master accepted the payment with a condescending smile, pleased that at least one of them understood their place. While handing over the money, the older man pleaded for better treatment for their kin, though the master stayed dismissive. The master assured them the slaves were valuable property he wouldn't easily destroy, before the uncle pulled Gaia away from the scene. Out on the deck, a lizardman warned Gaia that killing an imperial officer on their own ship would bring disastrous consequences, and Gaia apologized for his recklessness. Athos admitted he'd nearly lost his own temper too, acknowledging the man had it coming as they looked out over the water. Still shaken by what he'd seen, Gaia asked his uncle if there was any way they could help the enslaved man. He clarified he wasn't talking about a prison break, just wondering if they could negotiate with the owner to buy the man's freedom. His uncle laid out the grim reality. The man was a prisoner of war turned into imperial property, and far from the only one in that position. He asked if Gaia planned to buy back every slave they came across, pointing out they didn't have the money and had precious little freedom of their own under the Empire. Speaking as the chieftain, the uncle insisted there was no other way to handle it, leaving Gaia and the rest of the group in frustrated silence. As the ship sailed on, Gaia struggled to accept the idea that they were truly powerless to change any of it. The journey eventually brought them to Galleria, the massive imperial capital, where the wealth and culture of the Veratochorus Empire were on full display. Deep within the city, a formal report was delivered to the throne of Emperor Gordias III. The messenger detailed General Hibiscus's recent military successes, including the capture of Pyro's port and the crown prince's retreat from Kalon Castle. After the victory was formally credited to his name, Emperor Gordias III calmly acknowledged the report and praised the efforts of his forces. At a celebration, a group of nobles mocked the presence of barbarians, insisting brute soldiers of war couldn't possibly understand courtly manners. Ignoring the insults, Captain Gaia of the Barbarian Mercenary Corps and Vice Captain Ottos were formally addressed by an official about their impressive achievements in the recent campaign. The official introduced himself as Herman Malfoy, Feifel, explaining he'd be handling their commendations and rewards, which had the vice captain nodding how humble he seemed for an Imperial. Herman laid out their two major achievements, first killing an enemy commander at the Pyros Plains, then playing a crucial role in getting the Crown Prince safely back to the capital. Relieved that the prince's attendant had actually followed through, the vice captain admitted he doubted they'd see any reward at all, given the man's usual incompetence. Herman said the emperor was delighted the prince had returned safely and offered to grant them any request as a reward for their service. Stepping forward, the captain made a bold ask, a total permanent exemption from all future taxation for the barbarian people. The vice captain was caught off guard by the request, figuring immediate gold or goods would be more practical since their people were currently strapped for cash. But he quickly saw the strategic angle. No taxes would mean fewer imperial officers keeping tabs on their lands, loosening the empire's watch over their future plans. Herman acknowledged the request but explained the tax system was the very foundation of the empire, making a permanent exemption impossible, even as a special case. When Herman suggested a 5-year limit, the captain argued that was an insult given the prince's life had been at stake, and countered with a fair 30 years instead. As Herman pointed to the value of barbarian resources like lumber, the captain countered with records of heavy casualties and forced labor that made their old tax rates unsustainable. Watching the negotiation play out, the vice captain was impressed by Herman's composure, nodding he was a rare example of a genuinely reasonable imperial official. He realized his uncle had even been ready to offer a bribe, but figured that would likely backfire against someone as professional as this bureaucrat. Digging into the official's history, he learned Herman was a mid-level official of foreign descent who'd built a reputation for being exceptionally competent. Given the man's obvious skill and level head, the young man found it hard to believe he'd only reached a mid-level position in the bureaucracy. Herman finally settled on a maximum of 15 years for the tax exemption, promising to submit the formal proposal and send official documentation later. The vice captain was satisfied, figuring 15 years was more than enough time to rebuild the Bluemont tribe and quietly build the strength to eventually stand up to the empire. The captain expressed his deep gratitude for such generous terms, which Herman brushed off as simply the reward they'd rightfully earned, before a subordinate interrupted him. The aide quietly informed a stunned Herman that a brothel visited by the crown prince was demanding immediate payment for services rendered during his stay in Pyros. A man apologized for the intrusion while his host insisted it was no trouble, shifting the conversation to how His Highness Muna was doing, which drew a remark that the prince was doing more than fine. It turned out His Highness Muna spent his time indulging in luxury and excess, leaving officials in a constant struggle to manage the budget, while plenty of soldiers remained prisoners after the battle at Kalon Castle, with no ransom in sight. The mustachioed man acknowledged how tough the situation was, which led the other to speculate that the emperor's own fondness for drink suggested these troublesome traits just ran in the royal bloodline. Concerns came up about the emperor's worsening health and complexion from all the drinking, until an official cut the gossip short, though their host admitted the conversation had been pretty insightful. As the meeting wrapped up with promises to stay in touch, the two visitors walked off discussing Lord Herman, whom they considered a remarkably tough and impressive negotiator. The mustachioed man celebrated locking in a 15-year agreement when their original goal had only been 10, while his companion noted Lord Herman seemed way too capable for such a lowly position. They talked about how the empire's high offices were reserved for noble families no matter how talented someone was, leaving capable men like Lord Herman stuck in a system where merit and character only got you so far. While the older man lamented such wasted talent, the young man realized nepotism was pretty much a universal problem, though he figured their own people would never let a man this capable just sit idle. Taking in the bustling city, the young man realized the empire had gotten this advance through sheer volume, so many layers of talented workers that even a little wasted potential barely made a dent. The sheer scale of the empire made any single person feel small. At a local stall, the evening menu, bread and chicken onion soup, was called out as customers lined up shouting their orders. A lizardman waved Gaia over to join the table, while an elf girl confirmed they'd already saved him a portion. As they started eating, everyone praised how good the capital's food tasted, leaving the girl wondering why simple chicken onion soup was so much better here than usual. Gaia explained the better taste came down to salt and pepper, seasonings ordinary people here could actually afford, before the lizardman changed the subject, asking Jessica when the healing salves for his injured kin would be ready. Despite the lizardmen insisting they could just sleep off their injuries with a bit of ointment, the young man joked that this exact reckless attitude was why they kept ending up in trouble. Jessica mentioned her medicinal ingredients were running low, explaining that plants they could pick for free back home cost a fortune in the capital's markets. When the girl planned a trip to gather herbs in the nearby forest, the lizardman offered to tag along and learn to identify them himself, despite having zero prior knowledge. She warned that mistaking a poisonous plant for something safe was a real risk, which had the lizardman considering hunting the sheep out on the plains instead. After the young man pointed out those sheep were probably somebody's property, he smiled, nodding their group was finally becoming a solid, functional team. The lizardman asked Gaia how his day had gone, and the young man revealed he'd spent the afternoon visiting a noble's estate with his uncle. The young man poured out a massive pile of gold coins he'd collected on the journey, leaving his two companions stunned at the sheer amount of wealth in front of them. He explained that while the Empire had paid them for protecting the crown prince, there'd been no reward for the other noble children in the group, so they'd taken it upon themselves to collect what they were owed. Looking back on the mission, he admitted he'd put up with a lot of verbal abuse and condescending looks from nobles who'd treated them like nothing more than stray dogs. The memory of being looked down on simply for being labeled barbarians still irritated him whenever he thought about the imperial family's prejudice. While his companions were already impressed by the pile of treasure in front of them, he warned them not to get too comfortable, revealing they'd only collected from about half the noble houses they'd saved. The news that even more gold was on the way left the elf and the lizardman stunned, while the young man just laughed at their disbelief. His companions realized just how much buying power they now had and suggested they'd need to be very careful with how they spent it, a point he agreed with, his expression turning serious. As he secured the heavy bags of coins, he confirmed he'd already been working out a plan for how to put their newfound fortune to use.